Magnus Carlsen takes on Alireza Firouzja in the Norway Blitz tournament. Now, in the Norway chess tournament, which is a classical time control, they determine the seeding in one of the most interesting ways in chess. They have a blitz tournament before the main tournament begins, and how well people do in that blitz tournament determines their seeding in the main tournament. And this game was played in that blitz tournament. It's 3 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. Magnus Carlsen had white, Alireza Firouzja had black. Let us jump right in. Magnus begins with b3, an opening he's been playing quite a bit recently. d5, knight f3, bishop f5, bishop b2, and e6. And we can see what Alireza is doing. He's basically playing a London system reversed. And this is actually a fairly effective way to play against the b3 opening from white. g3 is played, a double fianchetto from Carlsen. h6, so the bishop can tuck back at h7 if it's threatened at some point, bishop to g2. And white really would like to play e4 at some point. Put his pieces d3, knight bd2, e4. Knight f6, castles, a5. Firouzja looks to gain space on the queen side, and here a3 is an option. A pretty good one, but Carlsen goes ahead and plays a4, and he gets more space, but he does have to worry about a knight landing on b4. That will be a very effective piece for black. Bishop to e7, d3, again planning that e4 push. Castles, knight b to d2. Now bishop to h7. Alireza anticipates white's going to play e4 and hit the bishop, so before white has a chance to do that, he tucks the bishop back at h7. Rook to e1, continuing the plan Carlsen has of e4. Now knight to a6. Alireza aims at the b4 square for the knight, e4, and now knight to b4. Now the knight on b4 aims at the c2 pawn. Now that pawn is defended at the moment, but it is an irritation for white. He needs to keep a defender on that pawn for the time being, and it's the queen doing it at the moment. Knight to e5. So Carlsen plays the knight to e5, unblocks the bishop at g2, but also the f-pawn can now advance to f4. So he's looking for an aggressive demonstration in the center and on the king's side. c6, strengthening d5. He wants to limit the scope of this bishop on g2 by creating a strong point on the d5 square. f4, Magnus continues, gaining space on the king's side. Queen to b6 check. One of the downsides of moving the f-pawn is that the queen can check on b6, and does so with tempo. King to h1. And rook a to d8. Firouzja places the rook opposite white's queen, and that makes exchanging on e4 potentially dangerous for white, so he has to be a little careful. And in the one game this position had been reached in before. Knight to g4 to trade off the knight at f6 was played, but Carlsen plays rook to e2, and that sort of indirectly defends the c2 pawn, among other things. Queen to a6, putting some indirect pressure on the e2 rook. Carlsen takes first on d5 and cd5, creating an asymmetrical structure, and now the rook can come to c8, and along with this knight, attack c2 directly. Carlsen plays knight d to f3, and here black plays knight to e8. The knight can reroute to the d6 square. Maybe he can play f6 to kick that knight away later. We'll see, but not after Carlsen's next move, knight to d4. And you can't play f6 now because e6 would hang. And if you look at these knights on d4 and e5 for Magnus, those are really well-placed knights. And Magnus has probably won the opening battle here. I think it's fair to say. His pieces are well-placed and centralized. In fact, the knight on d4 is so dangerous, the computer recommends queen to b6 with the idea of bishop to c5 to just get that knight out of there as quickly as possible. But Alireza goes ahead and plays knight to d6. He can play the knight to f5 to challenge the knight on d4 that way. So anticipating that, Carlsen plays g4, keeping that knight out of the f5 square. Rook to c8, attacking c2. But now f5. Carlsen is all in on the king side attack, and he has some serious pressure at this point. Alireza is in a spot of trouble. He plays rook f to e8, and here Judith Polgar, who was analyzing the game in the stream, said there would be no way she could resist playing the move knight takes f7 here. Just opening things, sacrificing a piece, and after knight f7, say knight to e6. and white has a very nice position. Computers actually say this is equal. White has given up a piece to get this position, but I would much rather have white here than black myself also. The best move apparently is just to take on e6 and to just work on that e6 weakness for white. But Magnus goes ahead and plays c3. That knight at b4 had become too annoying for him. The problem, of course, is that it weakens this d3 square, but the knight has to come back to c6 at the moment d3 is defended. Pawn takes, and here Firouzja should have gone ahead and taken that knight on d4. The knight on d4 is really the heart and soul of Carlsen's position. So if he could have captured that now, even after ef7, knight f7, and this is really an equal position. But he goes ahead and takes on e6. Knight takes c6. The knight on e5 takes c6. bc6, and now rook takes e6. And Magnus is a pawn for the moment. Bishop to f8. And Firouzja has two pieces attacking d3, so Carlsen plays c4, and that keeps those pieces, the queen in particular, out of the way. Black plays king to h8, and now queen to f3. And the truth is, Magnus has a huge advantage at this point. The question really is, can Firouzja fight back and defend against this huge advantage from Magnus? Queen to b7 to defend along that second rank for black. Rook to f1. Queen to d7, hitting the rook at e6. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. And here, Carlsen missed a crushing move. He could have played rook takes h6, and that would have been a knockout blow. Alireza could not recapture in this case because of just knight to e6 check, a discovered check from the bishop at b2. And then when the king moves, queen to f6, threatening mate on h8, and black would just have to give up the bishop and material. The game would just simply be over. But instead, Magnus plays rook to e8, a bit of an inaccuracy. Rook takes c8, and now queen takes f8 check, giving up the queen, but for a lot of material. It gets the bishop, the rook, and then also the other bishop that's at h7 after rook takes queen, rook f8, and he has no choice, Alireza, but to block with the bishop on from h7 to g8, and then bishop to d5, taking advantage of the pin on that piece. So Carlsen has gotten a lot of material in exchange for that queen. The queen goes to e7, rook takes g8 check, king to h7, and Magnus, with a huge advantage, misses really what is clearly a winning move, and that's knight to f3. And the threat now of rook takes g7 check would just basically end the game. Instead, he plays knight to e2, and as it turns out, Alireza could have actually taken that knight, because after rook takes g7 check, king h8, there's no discovery. Let's say he moves the rook to e7 to attack the queen while delivering check. The problem is the queen can just take the bishop, and then Alireza would be winning. But here he doesn't take the knight. He plays the knight back to e8 to help defend the g7 pawn. The rook takes the knight, and the queen takes the rook. Now, so we have three minor pieces, two bishops and a knight, and two pawns against the queen. The one thing Alireza has, the queen seems to it works really well. It's much easier to coordinate one piece than it is to coordinate three pieces. And also Magnus's king here on h1 is a little bit more exposed than black's. Bishop to e4 check, king has to move. It centralizes queen to c8, aiming at the g4 pawn, so Magnus defends. Queen to c7, threatening to play queen to g3 and getting in an annoying white, so king to g2 keeps it out. Queen to f4, threatening a check on d2. Bishop c3 covers that, so queen to c1. Knight to e2 hits the queen and also defends the bishop, so queen back to e3. Bishop to f3, queen takes pawn, but bishop takes a5. And Magnus is hoping he can make something of this past a pawn after queen takes b3. The knight goes to c3, which defends that pawn. Queen to c4, now bishop to e2. We can see how these pieces all defend each other. Queen to d4, bishop to b5, queen to d2 check, king f3, queen h2, now going after this pawn. And here Magnus makes a very committal move. He plays the bishop to b6. He wants to use these two bishops to escort this pawn to the queening square. The problem is, after this move, queen h3 check, this knight is now undefended. And when the king moves, queen takes c3. So the question is, very simply, will Magnus be able to get this pawn to a8 using these bishops, or will Firouzja be able to stop it and maybe even advance his own h-pawn to the queening square? King to d5, queen to b4, king c6, queen g4, taking the pawn on the king's side and leaving this h-pawn unblocked. You can advance without having to worry about another pawn. a5, queen to c8 check, bishop c7 blocks at h5, a6, h4. A bit of a race between these two pawns. King to b6, queen e6 check, bishop c6, queen to b3, king a5, queen to c3 check. Hitting the king and the bishop, so the king has to go back. Queen to b3 check, bishop to b5, queen to e3 check, king b7, queen to b3. Now the bishop at b5 is pinned, so the king again has to move back to defend. Queen to e3 check, king b7, and queen to b3. And in this position, it is a draw. They didn't actually repeat the position 3 times, but they just agreed because they were about to. So Firouzja came back from a very, very bad situation, a tough fight between 2 elite players, ending in a draw. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.